Greetings. I'm Andy Davis, and I'm so glad you've chosen to partake of the offerings of the remarkable people who have come together on this panel. One thing you should know is that between the time it was recorded on November 14th and now, evil enchanters or maybe Russian hackers conspired to delete the first few minutes of the recording. So right now, I will begin with an approximation of my original opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our first panelist, Eileen Evans, already a couple of sentences into her remarks. Enjoy. Welcome. Thank you for being here, siblings and fellow initiates or aspirants of the storytelling cult. Wherever you are on your path, I'm so glad you're with us this afternoon. The most important thing for me to do is to get out of the way and spotlight our august panel. So let me say a couple of quick words and then do that. First of all, thank you to the Nest Board and to Deborah and Cooper and all the people who are making this splendid weekend happen. And thanks to Rona Leventhal for inviting me and Stephen Hobbs to put this panel together. Second, this is a huge topic we're addressing, and we're only going to scratch the surface. But this is so important. I'm glad you're here. Third, if we do this right, you might be made uncomfortable by some aspects of this discussion. Social justice work is about comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. So if we're not risking something, we might not be doing it right. But this is also joyful. In the words of Tony Cade Bambara, it's about making the revolution irresistible. So, each of our illustrious panelists will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. Then we'll ask clarifying questions of each other for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then open it up to your questions. At the end of the hour and a half, there will be a chance to have an optional small group discussion for about 15 minutes. So our first panelist, Eileen Evans, is an Appalachian storyteller and Chautauqua scholar based in West Virginia. She's noted for her portrayals of women from history who have changed the world, including Harriet Tubman, Bessie Coleman, Eslanda Robeson, and others. Her work speaks to the issues of civil discourse, identity, social justice, human and civil rights, and gender equality. She is artistic director of Voices from the Earth Incorporated, a nonprofit arts academy. Stephen H. Hobbs is a lawyer, academic, storyteller, and community organizer, and a bunch of other things. He was a member of the Washington and Lee University law faculty for 16 years before accepting the position of Tom Bevel, chairholder of law at the University of Alabama School of Law in 1997, until his recent retirement. He also has visited at Willamette University and Florida State. Robert Shatterly is the creator of the portrait series Americans Who Tell the Truth, which honors the efforts of over 250 historic and contemporary U.S. people for a more just, peaceful, and livable world. In normal times, Rob travels the country introducing his portraits and telling the inspiring stories of his subjects. I asked him to tell me something that's not in his bio. He said he's a big fan of the English poet, artist, philosopher, mystic William Blake. He spent 3 years making images in response to Blake's Proverbs of Hell. One of his favorite proverbs is, "To create a little flower is the labor of ages." And finally, Judith Black is an internationally known, award-winning storyteller who always has had a political aspect to her work. But in the past few years, she's transformed herself and her work through her passionate commitment to raising the alarm about the climate crisis. She's a committed and active member of 350 Mass, the Jewish Climate Action Network, Extinction Rebellion, and a founder of Sustainable Marblehead, and a fanatic organic gardener. Oh, yeah, and she still tells stories. So, thank you for being part of our panel, and I hope you enjoy and profit from this time together.
I think it's a hard sell sometimes, because there are those who really believe that African Americans have no culture, no roots, no cultural background. And it is one of the connecting ways to find this through performing arts. And storytelling is probably one of the most significant ones of those arts that are available to us. And so today, my three thoughts were about the historical place of storytelling in our community as in a response to oppression, to the ongoing misinformation, the hijacking of a narrative away from the people who should be able to speak their own story, to replace it with truth. And then the point about some of the personal experiences that I have had in my work as I tour and travel and do come into many, many different communities with a similar story about liberation, about self-reliance, about the rich cultural context that we bear, and then to talk about a little bit about the way we have framed stories as a foundation to help us enter into civil discourse. How do we create a place where we can have conversations, not just lectures or diatribes or, somebody with the big finger yelling all the time, but a real conversation, both amongst us and building bridges between us. And so I went back to think about some of those early stories that triggered these ideas in myself. And one of them, of course, was Brer Rabbit. Brer Rabbit, and in the folk tales that they represent, really helped me understand how we could take back what had been appropriated by others and give it the context that brought us dignity again, a sense of clarity. I was brought back to the Brer Rabbit in the protest meeting, and maybe you've heard that. It was collected by William Faulkner in that wonderful book called The Days When the Animals Talked. And there's the protest meeting. They want to have the short tails get long tails just so that they can live a little bit easier from all those pestery bugs. And as they go to this meeting, they are opposed by the long tails who are afraid of losing what tails they have. Maybe God will make the decision that they should all have short tails and then they'll lose what they have. And this pressure back and forth between the two groups, one group a little bit smaller, not quite as strong, unable to bring their voice to God, was a story that was able to help me see in metaphor, in fable, in another way, part of the hearing that we have, how we had participated and how we could change that participation, how we could take our power back, and how much we deserved that power. And so the significance to me of folk tales, of storytelling, opening up a conversation is very, very powerful. In my personal work, beyond traditional storytelling, has come the work in building portrayals of historical women and figures who have stood strong against incredible numbers and opposition. I started with Harriet Tubman. And as Mother Harriet was able to not only stand against those who would have her returned as a piece of property. She stood against those men who thought this was not a proper place for a woman. She stood against those in the church who believed that this was not the proper work for anyone. And when she was able to listen to herself with such integrity and consistent belief in herself, the integrity of that step forward she took brought all of us with her. And I remember hearing, was Ronnie Gilbert singing Lifeline and Holly Near. Last night I dreamed I was in slavery, about 1850 was the time. Sorrow was the only sign, nothing around to ease my mind. Out of the night appeared a lady leading a distant pilgrim band. First mate, she yelled, pointing her hand, make room aboard for this young woman, singing, come on up, I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine. And she was telling the story of Harriet Tubman in a way that made it an immediate visceral connection. She reaches out her hands and she reaches for that person who's having this dream, and she pulls that person up. I thought of, when I heard the song, I thought of, well, actually, I was on my way to a workshop where we were going to be opening up the myth of Prometheus. And I saw her as one of those Promethean characters who brought the light for others through the darkness at the cost of her own survival. And I realized that these stories were not just stories of people. They were stories that were handholds for those of us who were looking for our identity, for those of us who were looking for dignity, for those of us who needed to have a mentor, someone who had carved out the path before us and ahead of us. And so I found, as I placed her story in my own body and then carried it to school after school after school, some of the kinds of questions that I got revealed a level of understanding that was a heart need for all people. We all need to feel that we have value. We all need to feel that we have something to offer this world. We all need to feel we have a place, that we belong, that we are loved. And I could see in these children's eyes, as we brought these stories there, it gave them something much more than a history lesson. It gave them a sense of personhood. What is more valuable than that? There was one young man, I remember it was a third grade audience in a huge auditorium in Calhoun County. Yes, in Calhoun County. And I'm on a big stage. It was a beautiful stage. And in West Virginia, that is kind of a rare, beautiful thing to have. But about halfway back in the theater, when it came for time for question and answers, the young man raised his hand and I saw him and I asked him to go ahead and give us his question. His question was, why are your hands a different color from your feet? It was absolutely an innocent question. He was unaware. It was from a place of innocent ignorance. At that time, we were still able to do the program barefooted, and we can't do that way anymore. But at the time, my hands had been in the sun and my feet had not. And so this opportunity to talk about melanin, to talk about the differences between us, it was a learning moment. It was a learning moment when they asked me about my hair. And I could say, well, my hair has a lot of strength. I could frame a cultural difference in a way that brought a new conversation forward and brought people's dignity with it. And so I look at these personal opportunities as a really important teaching moment for every storyteller as well. And I'm sure many of you have had some of those experiences somewhere in your telling and in your crossing bridges region to region. And the last thing I thought I would mention has to do with our lack of opportunity for practicing civil discourse. And what do I mean by that? I was really challenged when I got it was at an NSN conference and we had a workshop with Ed Rader and oh no, Dennis Rader. And he was talking about the difference between learning like from a lecture or from a book or learning from a conversation. And the conversation had a very certain kind of properties that came with it. The properties of honest engagement, of each having something to bring toward the commonwealth of knowledge, that no matter who they were in that random group that we were, someone had something to offer each of us. And that opened up the beginning of us laying down a foundation to build conversations, to build guidelines that were based on the idea of guardianship, guarding the well-being of those in that conversation, guarding the conversation, guarding the sense of its integrity so that we would all gain and benefit from what was learned and shared in that. And so we looked for 5 guardians. We started to do this when we were shifting around with Bessie Coleman's stories and we were going in and out of schools. We wanted 5 guardians to represent different ways of keeping a small group and their well-being and the conversation moving forward, not spinning and actually going away with something. And those 5 guardians would be: 1, to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to speak; 2, to ensure that the question at hand was the center of the conversation to keep them on task; 3, that somebody was recording it and being responsible for the memory of the group; that somebody was willing to be a spokesperson to bring that the results of that conversation back to the larger group; and 5th was that there was a guardian who watched the tone of the group, the climate, to keep a sense of respect and tolerance within the group. And as we've used that as a guideline and we travel to, whether it's a college or sometimes I'm working with teachers around the same thing, and we need it. That's it. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you for providing those handholds and that thoughtful reflection. And so now on to Stephen. Professor Hobbs, take it away.
Thank you, Andy. 2020 will be remembered for many things. The one that sticks in my mind is no justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. And you heard those in the movements, often led by the Black Lives Matter, in their standing up against the grave injustices of the police and law enforcement systems and the court systems, where you're supposed to be able to obtain justice, but seemingly you cannot. Of course, we all know about George Floyd and the symbol of that being, I can't breathe. If any of you watched CNN news after it was announced that Mr. Biden would be the president-elect, Van Jones, one of the commentators, actually cried because he said, I can't breathe is not only something that George Floyd said, but it's something that we have all felt, that in this society, it is difficult to breathe if we don't have justice, and we have justice in a complete way. So this notion about social justice is a very broad one. And I want to just reflect on at least what I'm thinking of is some of the issues that involve the law enforcement and the police enforcement and our systems of courts. Now, the other name that we always hear too in this regard is Brianna Taylor, and how the police ended up killing her. It still bothers me and boggles my mind that no one was charged with her death, whereas a neighbor, at least one of the police officers was charged with reckless endangerment. If Brianna wasn't killed by reckless endangerment, I don't know how we get to a system that seems just and fair. There are other instances in our criminal justice system that we don't see often, but are just as tragic. The New York Times did a expose of the Alabama prison system, and they discovered that rape and murder and physical assault ran rampant in the Alabama jails and prisons, both the female prisons and jails as well as the males. And no one could do anything, it seems, about that. It was just something that was accepted. But the injustice to that is certainly palpable. So how do we deal with those types of big time injustices? And I think of them as big time injustices because when you hear about a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, and it's really terrible, it grabs the national attention. It seems, and as a law professor, I look at the lawyers who appear, and certainly lawyer Crump, Benjamin Crump, seems to always be there on the big cases. And sometimes you'll see Al Sharpton, bless his heart, who actually preached the funeral for George Floyd. But those are the big ones that get the national attention, that gets the TVs, so those lawyers stand in front of the microphones and talk about the injustice of it all. And as we hear those systemic examples of injustice, we do not hear about what I'm calling micro injustices. That is, those small things that happen on a day-to-day basis that deprive an individual as what Eileen talked about in terms of our own human dignity. And there's no justice and no peace in those things. Many of you know of the term microaggressions. Those are the things on a daily basis that particularly African Americans, but other groups as well, feel these senses of, well, here's a definition. Microaggressions are small daily insults and indignities perpetrated against marginalized or oppressed people. And comes from Ijeoma Olua. And that idea that every day you're confronted with those things when you walk out the door. Are you going to be walking down the street and be accosted by the police because you're in a community that is predominantly white? One of my favorite examples are certainly President Obama was subject to that. One day he wore a light tan suit. He looked very good because he's a good dresser. And he was criticized for debasing the presidency because he should be wearing a blue or dark gray or black suit. And that was just too casual for a president to be wearing a tan suit, even with a tie. Well, if you went back even to as far as President Reagan, every president since, there were pictures of them wearing light tan suits. So it's that sense that our society is looking at us in a different way. And because of the color of our skin, we get scrutinized in a way that ends up being a personal insult. When I was in law school, the thing was to call on a professor would call on a student, called cold call. And professor would go down the road calling on different students. And when he got to a black student, he would change rows. And he never called on a black student and go, no, that's an insult to our dignity. And there's so many of those that you can name. Someone comments about the style of your hair, or says to you, "Oh, you're pretty articulate," and that those are certainly those things that make our life seem less than others. Now, in the criminal justice system, I think that there are those certain things as well in terms of how we interact with the man, as we like to call it, with the police system. Our confrontation with them are always suspect. You've heard about giving the talk. How do you, if you get pulled over, how do you react? Where do you put your hands on on the steering wheel? How do you get your driver's license out before the police officer comes up to your car? Because we know that if you make the wrong move, you could end up dead. So those are the types of stories that we sometimes hear, but there are others. I refer to in my own family. I know my son had some vandalism done to one of his vehicles, and he called me over to his house as a witness. When he called the police, an officer arrived, and the officer was very skeptical about, well, how did that get broken? You must have done that yourself. And because my son's voice is naturally loud, the police officer began to get sort of aggressive. Are you drunk? I don't believe what you're saying. And fortunately, he had called for backup, and the sergeant who came and sort of took over the questioning actually listened to my son and recorded his story the way he told it, in a way that demonstrated respect to him. And those different clashes happen too often. My son was living in an apartment. He was washing his clothes in the laundromat there at the apartment building. He went upstairs and he came back down. His clothes were gone. And when he called the police, they took him into the jail, into the police headquarters, and questioned him to see if those were actually his clothes. And so every time it seems that sometimes when you ask for help, you are first viewed not as the victim, but as the perpetrator of some crime. Those little micro aggressions or micro injustices can accumulate and impact how we move through our society. And it's that ability to feel our own sense of place, our own sense of who we are, our own humanness, our own ability to be in a society where our freedom is not only guaranteed but also respected and expected. And it's those types of things that we see. And it happens not only in terms of encounters with the police, but it also happens when you end up in a court system. Sometimes if you have a lawyer, whether you could afford one or one is appointed to you, oftentimes, and you've been in the hallway outside the courtroom before a case is called, that's the first time the lawyer may have met his client. And what they will do is, well, the DA's got this and he's got that. And if you go to trial, you could end up with 5 years, but they've offered you this plea, you could be in jail for a year, maybe with good time, only 6 months. And then you'll be free. You can go on, you won't have to face 5 years. And those types of plea bargains happen all the time. And what ends up happening is that now you have a criminal record, and that impacts your opportunity for jobs and impacts your opportunity to build a family. Those types of small injustices occur. It also occurred in terms of the bail system. When Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the U.S. Justice Department did a deep dive into the criminal justice system in Ferguson. And while they looked at the interaction between the police and the citizens, they also saw that things like cash bail bond were keeping people in jail when a small amount could let them out until their trial came. They looked at the injustices of fines, where if you violate your parole, you might get a fine. If you don't pay your fine, they put you in jail. And so this can be cyclical. They put you out, they let you out, and they say you have to pay this fine. You don't pay the fine, they put you back in jail. And it's that what I call spin cycle in the washing machine sense that we feel that sense of micro injustices as well. I want to gather up these stories because I've tried to tell these stories. I've told them to city council folks, so and made presentations and said, we need a way of dealing with this. We need a way of handling the injustices that occur on a day-to-day basis that don't make the headlines, that don't call for Ben Trump to come down and stand in front of a bank of microphones. There's those things that happen that accumulate that make our justice system seem so unfair. So that when things happen like a George Floyd, everyone in the whole community erupts in this sense of violence, if you will. That is that harshness that has been building and building and building has to have some place to go. So I found that there are organizations that, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, and some of those types of organizations, they also look for the big cases, the big death penalty cases, but who's looking out for the small ones? I was reminded by my friend Rona of a story called the theft of smell. And many of you know the story about the poor man standing outside the bakery. And he's there just smelling the bread as it was breaking. And the baker came out and asked him, what are you doing? And he said, just smelling the bread. And the baker says, you owe me for that. And they got into an argument, and they finally took them down to King Solomon. And King Solomon heard the story about this, he's smelling my bread without paying for it. And Solomon asked the poor man, do you have any money? And he says, just a few coins here, not hardly anything to pay back what he might be charging. And he said, well, jingle those coins around in your hand. And as he did, Solomon looked at the baker and says, you have been paid. What? He hasn't given me any money. Well, the smell of the bread is equivalent to the sound of the money. You have received your justice. So we need a King Solomon. We need a place where our community can go to solve these disputes, where these things can be brought to light, where we can hear the stories of micro injustices, where we can have an audit of how our system is actually working on the ground, what's going on in the courts, what's going on in the initial encounter with the police. And we don't tell those stories when we have a big thing like a George Floyd, and we ask, why are people so angry? And so it's those types of stories that suggest that human dignity and our sense of personhood are being threatened on a daily basis in very small ways. As a death by several thousand cuts, as it were. Is the ability to live free, the notion of freedom, not freedom from fear, freedom from oppression, but also freedom to exist in the world, to love and to have a home and have a job, the freedom to be. And I want to share with you probably a song. I'm not going to truly sing it, but I wanted to share at least a couple of verses of it. It's a song by Shirley Arena Murray. It's called For Everyone Born a Place at the Table. And the verses, two of the verses I want to particularly highlight. One of them goes like this. For everyone born a place at the table. For everyone born clean water and bread, a shelter, a space, a safe place for growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And for everyone born, a place at the table, to live without fear and simply to be, to work, to speak out, to witness and worship. For everyone born, the right to be free. And her chorus goes like this. And God will delight when we are creators of justice in joy, compassion, and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And now on to Brooksville, Maine, and Rob Shatterly.
Hi, thank you. And it was so wonderful to hear those other stories. Um, Andy mentioned that previous to being a portrait painter, I was a surrealist. And in that guise, I wanted other people to tell the stories. I would make a mysterious image and expect that they would come up with something. Everyone else would look at it and decide what it meant or could mean. And now that all changed for me though after 9/11. And it changed because not because of 9/11 itself, but because of the promotion of the Iraq War by the Bush administration. All the propaganda and lying they were doing to make that war possible. And I was so full of rage and grief, what Terry Tempest Williams calls sacred rage at what was going on because of the enormous number of victims there would be. And I thought, I've got to use whatever talents I have to become much more engaged as a citizen at this time, but it was very hard for me to figure out what exactly I could do. I mean, I know I wanted to use painting because that's what I do best. I was not a storyteller at all. But I thought, well, how to do that? I didn't want to just use painting to rant the way a lot of artists do, and I have done myself at many times. I wanted to do something positive, to take all the energy of my anger and grief and make, something that was, well, as Eileen said, that would make a conversation possible. And it took me a long time to figure out what that would be. And then I thought, well, instead of ranting about George Bush and Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, et cetera, what I could be doing is surrounding myself with Americans that make me feel good about this country because of what they have given to it and what they have demanded from it. And that changed my life. I painted a picture of Walt Whitman, and then I painted Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is who one time, said, God, what ails this Constitution? And God said to her, Sojourner, there is a little weasel in it. And that statement has become kind of a motto of the Americans Who Tell the Truth project. That's, as Andy said, I've painted, and it's actually closer to a little over 250 of these portraits. And what they really amount to are the people who have chased that weasel, who have tried to insist that this country live up to its own ideals, to walk its own talk. And in the process of painting the ones that I knew about or discovered, I've been barraged with suggestions from all over the place about people to paint. I had a show in the Sewell Belmont House in Washington, D.C. of portraits of women and men having to do with the women's rights movement. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and asked me if I would paint a portrait of a woman from Virginia. And I said, well, send me some names and I'll choose somebody. And sometime later, I got a letter from her, and included in it, amongst a bunch of names, was the one of Barbara Johns. I assume some of you may know who Barbara Johns was. I had never heard of her. But I researched her and found that this was exactly the kind of person I wanted to paint, especially because I spend now so much time in schools showing the paintings and telling the stories of the people I paint. And Barbara Johns was one of these teenage people who actually changed the direction of this country and is largely unheralded. She was born in 1935 in New York City, but at the end of the Depression, the beginning of the World War II, they moved back to where they had family in Farmville, Virginia, which is a little community south of Richmond. And they had a farm there. And so Barbara grew up on the farm. And she was going to, by the time she was a teenager, to an all-Black high school. This was still the era of separate but equal. And as it was going on, she was getting more and more angry because of the deficiencies of her school. I mean, close by was a white public high school that in comparison was like a country club. And Barbara was going to this school that didn't have any library. It had very little heat. It was made for 200 students. There were 450. A lot of the kids were in classrooms in abandoned school buses. It was, she knew that the chances of her life were becoming diminished because she was receiving a poor education. And she wanted that changed. And so she kept thinking, you know, what could I do? And she did the equivalent of what you would call going through channels. She went to one of her favorite teachers and outlined why she thought this school should be changed. And the teacher said to her, well, why don't you do something about it? And Barbara took that to heart, and it took her months to figure out a plan. But she didn't want to tell the plan to other people because she thought if she told the plan to other people, they might squeal at her. So she kept it to herself, and the plan was pretty elaborate and also dangerous. So one morning in April of 1951, she wrote a letter, sent a note to the principal of the school, whom she wanted to get rid of, get him out of the school because he thought he would interrupt her plan. So she sent him this note that said, there's some kids from Moton High School, the black high school, the separate but unequal high school. She said, there's some kids from Moton down in the center of town, the white center of town, causing a ruckus. Something ought to be done about it. And of course, this is very upsetting to the principal and something that the black community would not want. So he got in his car and left the school. She then sent notes to all the teachers, and that said there's going to be an emergency meeting of everybody, you know, all 450 kids and all the teachers, and she had forged the principal's signature on these notes. So the teachers brought, it's not clear because the school had no cafeteria. I don't know exactly where they met, in the halls or something. They brought all these kids, you know, they all showed up with the teachers, wondering what this important message was. And all of a sudden, Barbara stands up and gives this impassioned talk about the importance of education for them and the importance of the future of their lives and their professions, and how that all depended on the education they got. And she said, I'm going to walk out of this school right now, and I'm going to walk to the superintendent, the white superintendent's office, and demand a better school, a separate and really equal school. And she said, you know, I want all of you kids, all of you to come with me. Barbara walked out of the school. 450 kids followed her, not the teachers, but the kids. They did walk to the superintendent's office. She strode forward and presented her case to the superintendent and said, you know, we want a better school, and why? And he said to her, Barbara, you all better go back to school right now or you'll be suspended, and your parents will lose their jobs. I mean, this was a tactic of white power during, you know, the civil rights era. It happened very often. You know, the first tactic before much more drastic things was often to have anybody who was an activist lose his or her job. So she said, no, I don't think so. We're going to go on strike. So the kids struck the school, and the parents actually got behind the kids. They held a mass meeting and voted to support the kids. This was, by the way, 1951. This was the first time a black community had done a civil rights action of this sort. So they got behind the kids, and then the situation, you know, just sort of sat there and boiled over, and the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in her yard, and her life was threatened. Two lawyers in Richmond, Virginia, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, who were part of the NAACP legal defense team, heard about this, and they came to Farmville, and they sought out Barbara. You know, there's something really important here, is that when somebody shows courage, whether it's a young person, old person, it's the person with courage who becomes the teacher then. Barbara was teaching this community how to stand up and demand their due. So lawyers came to her and said, Barbara, we'd like to take your case, but if you really want, you know, an equal education, you're probably going to have to demand integration, because they're not going to give it to you otherwise. It'll have to be an integrated school. And so Barbara said, of course, well, let's do integration. Well, they filed a case that stayed in the courts for 3 years, and then became one of the 5 prime cases of Brown versus Board of Education. So this, you know, that, you know, in a way that you can say that, you know, some of the impulse for Brown came from a 16-year-old girl who was fed up with a bad education system and an unjust education system. what happened next is of course, this was in Prince William County is that the other? I think so. In Virginia, which, they closed the schools down rather than integrate. But, that story about how she did that, moves me enormously. And there's more to it though. The two lawyers, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, were actually working with Thurgood Marshall. They had all been students of Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard University Law School. And they had been looking for cases like this. Their teacher at Howard had been Charles Hamilton Houston, who had back in the early 1930s had realized that in order to build a society that believed in integration, it was probably going to have to change through the schools. And he began, Charles Hamilton Houston, bringing cases to the Supreme Court in the 1930s, demanding that the schools actually be separate but equal. And then when they couldn't do that, demand integration. He won a lot of these cases in front of the Supreme Court. He would have been the one who carried that case forward, but he died of a heart attack in 1950. Thurgood Marshall, his favorite student, picked up the banner and brought these other students along with him, who built the case for Brown versus Board. The one thing that's kind of sad about this is Barbara Johns did not live a long life. She died in the 1990s. She was only in her 50s. But this was the one amazing act of her whole life. She was not an activist. She ended up as a librarian in the Philadelphia schools, married to a minister with 5 kids. But this incredible thing, and the courage of this thing. Oh, by the way, I was going to ask Cooper to put up the painting of her. I forgot all about that. If he's there, he can share it. There she is. Yeah. When I try to talk now, I'm getting an echo, so maybe take it down. Yeah, good. Anyway, last thing I'd say about her is when she was asked later about wasn't she scared to do what she did because of the death threats and everything else. She said that no, she wasn't scared. She realized that this was her moment and she had to seize it. When I go into schools and am able to tell these stories, and direct them at kids, the point is that young people have a particular ability often to speak from a place of idealism that's unobstructed by the compromises that a lot of adults make. And when they do that, they can often be exceedingly powerful because of the clarity of what it is they want and how willing they are to stand behind it. And so whether it's Barbara Johns or Samantha Smith or Claudette Colvin, these are all young people, Emma Tenayuka from Austin, Texas, young people who have made a huge difference by standing up. I've made a point of painting their portraits and telling their stories. Oh, thank you.
Am I unmuted? Yes. Thank you, Rob. Splendid. And I love that story. And I just have to tell people, you really need to see the portraits face to face. They're kind of 2.5 feet by 3 feet, and they're quite arresting. And especially when you have a bunch lined up, they really challenge you. Rob loans a few of them to the World Fellowship Center each summer. So when we walk into our dining hall, we have these amazing, challenging people looking at us kind of straight on saying, and what have you done today? So let's move right along to Judith Black.
Hi. This has been a remarkable group. So Robert, to your point, the Sunrise Movement is all young people advocating for climate. And make no mistake, climate issues are justice issues. Bangladeshians who burn very little fossil fuels and have a minimal lifestyle in terms of all the stuff we have, they're already up to their knees in the water. It is our social justice communities that have highways running through them and factories near them, so their lungs are more challenged. So climate is a justice issue. Okay, now time for a story, because that's what we do, isn't it? It's called Oh God.
Judy, hi, this is Terry. Now, you know, we've always been friends and I like you. So there's something you need to know.
Oh God. When this is the recitative of a conversation, you don't want to hear the aria. You want to say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy debating religion with 12 Jehovah's Witnesses in the living room. Gotta go. Or a tsunami just broke the coast. Was I that quick?
And I've always liked you, so there's something you need to know. The club she's referring to is the Rotary Club that I made my husband join with me almost 15 years ago so that we could learn to have, as Eileen talked about, conversations with conservatives. The club is really kind of just sick and tired of you talking about the environment all the time.
I attempt a warm, neutral tone. Terry, I understand it is overwhelming and odious, but you understand, don't you, that we have brutal droughts now and firestorms and nitrogen from factory farming is killing the oceans and the lakes. The glaciers are melting, the poles are melting. We've got extinction events. 120 species die out every day. Pretty soon there will be more plastic than fish.
Oh, Judy. Oh, look, I could be Cary Grant. We all recycle. What more do you want?
And it was in that moment I realized I was the Jewish Cassandra, the goddess of bad news that nobody wants to hear. And she was just a friendly Walmart shopper. I'd been in this club for 15 years and they were still utilizing single-use plastic water bottles despite my endless attempts at education. I have to be the worst climate activist on the frickin' planet. I don't know. I mean, like, once you've read This Changes Everything and The Sixth Extinction, The End of Nature, and all of E.O. Wilson, it leaves you in one of two states, either on your couch, honey, get me a catheter for the duration, which turns out to be not nearly as long as any of us had hoped, or we're all gonna die, chicken apocalypse little. It turns out that neither of these are very successful organizing techniques. Oh God, I need help. Oh God. Oh God. That's what I had to do. What my tribe has done from time immemorial, to go back to the book or the scroll, if you want to be completely correct, and see what other people have done in end time situations. So, okay, y'all know the first one. Who built the ark? I imagine God saying, Noah, now we've always been friends and you know I like you, so there's something you need to know. And the Lord explains that the blueprint for humans was maybe off and he's got to get rid of them, but Noah's okay because he's an organic gardener and he should gather his family and the animals. Now, does Noah argue with God? No. Does he try to go and tell people to repent? No. He builds the ark, gets the family and the animals on board, and he's out of there. Okay, he did have the first floating stock. That's a joke, you guys. It's really hard to make climate jokes. Okay, but that's not the model I was looking for. I'd like to save everyone. Okay, the next one, a little more esoteric, but if you're biblical at all, you'll remember Abraham had a nephew named Lot, and Lot lived in the village of Sodom. You know the word that was created out of Sodom. So the Lord says, Abraham, now you know I like you. We've always been friends. There's something you need to know. All the people of Sodom, they're corrupt and evil. I'm going to kill them all. Well, that's his nephew that lives there. So of course, Abraham isn't afraid to schmooze with God. God, what if there are 50 righteous people there? All right, then I won't do it. How about 40, God? Well, I'll think about it. God, how many are you going to save? A lot. Get it? That was a joke too. Yeah, never mind. So the angels come, and Lot, quick, you don't want strange guys on the street in Sodom. It's just not safe. So he gets them quickly into his house. And when the angry men of Sodom come, give us those guys, he offers his daughters who have never known men. Taking hospitality to an extreme, I think. But they weren't interested in the girls. They wanted the guys. Now, okay, so Lot saved the angels. He got his family out of town, the wife, we won't go into that. But again, this is not the model I'm looking for. He didn't try to change the way people lived. He didn't argue with God. He just, Judy, are you still there? Yeah, Terry, just 1 second. God, these aren't the models I'm looking for. Okay, maybe Noah was shy. Maybe those people wouldn't talk to him. Maybe all he could do was build an ark. And he did save the animals and his family. Okay, he did what he could do. And Lot, well, maybe the men of Sodom and Gomorrah were kind of set in their ways and there was no changing them. And all he could do was save the angels. He did what he could do. Judy, oh, Terry, you are the most awesome real estate agent. Oh, thank you. I mean, we wouldn't have a house without you. Listen, I get the Union of Concerned Scientists magazine, and there's an article in there about how property values are changing because of the rising ocean levels. And they even have this interactive map in 10-year increments. And I thought you might be really interested in that. Oh yeah, I would. Great, want to meet me for tea at the Blue Canoe tomorrow? Are you free at 3? I have a showing, I'm free at 3:30. 3:30, you're on then, I'll see you there. Great, see you there, thanks. Bye. Thanks. Oh God. So that story was created for other climate activists to try to figure out how we can best actually communicate with people, because obviously facts have not done the trick. Science, though 99% of all scientists who aren't being paid off by the fossil fuel industry are in agreement. We have less than 11 years to turn this ship, and all other justice issues rest on our survival. We've got to get in there and work. Since facts don't work, it's time for the storytellers. Here we are. And we know this. We know that story leaves people's gates of perception open. That when you attack someone, they close up and they defend. But when you tell a story about someone or something else, their heart opens and they listen. So darlings, I think this is up to us. Now on a panel, it's hard to get into the weeds, but I just want to outline for you ways that you can create these stories that speak truth to power. And they start the way all of our best stories do, in our personal experience. So you find the thing that really spoke to you about what's going on in our world. General doesn't work. Nobody identifies with the general. How many of you grew up with Dick and Jane and Sally? I mean, you couldn't not want to read. Those were so fascinating, right? Look, Dick, look, here comes Sally. We want to know details. We love hearing about people's lives. So choose something specific and say, what is my connection with that? So one, you choose the personal event that speaks to you. So by example, I have a good friend, my best friends, Jack and Linda, their grandson. Danny is amazing. And as in high school, he was captain of the soccer team. He was handsome and strong, had the same girlfriend for 4 years. They adored him, and he got into Middlebury College. Once you've decided your story, We learn through windows and mirrors, and people need to see a mirror themselves before they're willing to walk into a window of some new thought. So create a mirror for your audience, whoever they are. If it's parents, you can say, how many of you are parents? How many of you are grandparents? Do you have children who play sports? Do you have children who've gone on to college? But you can shape your beginning to create that mirror so people feel comfortable and start to see themselves in your story. Once you've created that, then on to 3, which is shape the story so that people can see and feel it, so that it's real for them. Danny went on to Middlebury College. I remember the first year he came home and he had really hard classes, so he always took one easy class, and he thought it would be in Jewish film. So he came back and he instructed us on why Woody Allen was funny, only on the East and West Coast, but not in the middle of the country. We were in hysterics. And then in his sophomore year, he calls home and says, Mom, I don't know what it is. I can't seem to focus, and I'm not remembering what's going on in my classes. His mother, who is a therapist, suggested 2 things. 1, that he get a test for Lyme, and the 2, he go see the counselor. He did both. The Lyme test came up negative. The counselor said, you're the best adjusted young man I've ever met. But after about another 2 months, he had to drop out of college. Nothing was going right for Danny. He couldn't focus, he couldn't remember. He came home and his parents did everything they could to try and get a diagnosis and figure out what was going on. And it took 2 years. 2 years before they went to a specialist who asked if they'd had a Lyme test. And they said, yeah, the school did a Lyme test. And he explained that the test the school probably used was the inexpensive one and a very broad test. He explained that Lyme had changed, it had mutated, and that now the tests were much more specific, and it was only then they discovered that it was now running rampant through their son. You come into your conclusion, which is connect the dots. That's your part 4. Danny now lives in his parents' basement. He's been there for 5 years. On good days, he comes up, he says hi, he can nod through a conversation or take a walk. But on the other days, they just hear him crying. Ticks. We have more ticks than we could ever have imagined, and they have mutated as the disease they carry has become more distinct and deadly. Why? Because we are warming our climate. And so ticks don't die off in the winter anymore. They live through the winter and mutate. This is our climate crisis. And our burning of fossil fuels, our reliance on plastic, so many other things have created this. We have got to attack them one at a time and come back to a sane place where we live, not against, but with our planet, so that we don't have any more Dannys. So you see, find your connection, create the mirror, then bring them in through the window of the story, connect the dots to the crisis, and ask for their action. And when Eileen sang, I don't know about you guys, it completely drew me out of this. So I just want to end with a song because we can. This is by Greg Greenway. And I want you to do the chorus. You're gonna have to do it on mute because you've heard there's a gap in, everyone sounds crazy when you sing together, like a cacophony out of Marat Sade. But it goes like this. This is by Greg Greenway. You got to do what must be done. You got to do what must be done. Some see beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. Okay, I'm gonna teach it to you. You got to do what must be done. Try it with me and do the hands because it actually helps you remember. You got to do what must be done. You got to do what must be done. That second part, you got to do what must be done. Some see beyond the horizon. Some see beyond the horizon, and they do what must be done. Again, some see beyond the horizon, and they do what must be done. Well, I learned as a child that there are two ways to see the world as it is or the way it could be. Some people say, it's just not my problem. Some people do what must be done. Your turn. Some people do what must be done. They do what must be done. They see beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. They see the tear in the fabric that must be sewn. They see the way blockaded and they roll back the stone. They see the day beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. Last time, some people do what must be done. They do what must be done. Some people see beyond the horizon and they do what must be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. So the really excellent news is that we've had 4 wondrous presentations. The not so great news is they've all gone a little bit long, which so what I'm going to do with my moderator prerogative is to cut out the back and forth between panelists, and we have about 11 minutes for questions from everybody else in the room. And then I may have neglected at the beginning to say that there's an optional opportunity for breakout rooms that will only last about 15 minutes because then this room will be needed for the next event. So I'll take questions now. They can be in the chat, and they can also be the old-fashioned way, raising your hand, and I can call on you, but you'll have to unmute yourself. Somebody take the podium. Time's a wasting.
I think the first thing I need to say on behalf of everybody, I think, is the affirmations to the 4 tellers and you, Andy, for bringing this much overwhelmingly helpful material to the surface. Just great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, and there's so many people raving about how wonderful you all are that you might have missed them. So I'm curious, Eileen, there was a question as to whether you could post in the chat just those 5
The roles of the guardian.
Yes, if you
I
could
have
write
that
down.
I'm going to be slow to type it. I can say it for you again, or you can go to my website, Voices from the Earth, VFTE.org, and you'll see that we have PDF resources available there, and it is included in the Bessie Coleman American Aviator Teacher Resources. But why I say that is that I think people can use their own common sense. I created this out of our need. So the 5, each person gets to speak. Somebody is the guardian that the center of the conversation stays on the question at hand, a task person. Somebody's recording it so that there is a witness to what is going on. The memory of the group is important. And to bring somebody who's a spokesperson to bring those thoughts back to the larger group, representing them. And the last one is to ensure that the tone remains one of respect and tolerance. So those are 5 I picked out because a small group of 5 is a really good way of dividing up like a college group of 30 or so. But there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think depending on your situation, you might adjust what those guardians are, how they're defined for your purposes. But it is available. And if you go to our website, and I sent that website information to Andy, and maybe he can share it to the group as a whole. But we're ongoing with teacher resources. I mean, nobody does teacher resources better than Judith. I'm just saying. There's somebody on that. But we do have some, and that's where you would find them available that you can like print off, download, and so on.
Thank you, Eileen. So in a few minutes, Cooper will break those who remain into breakout rooms. But we have time for a couple more questions. And were there any more questions in the chat that somebody wanted to share?
Oh, there was one, somebody asked if Appalachian, if I made it up. No, I didn't make it up. Frank Walker actually made it up. He's an Appalachian poet. But I use the word Appalachian. And Lynn Ford now, we both call ourselves Appalachian storytellers. And we do that because our people are based out of the culture of the mountains. And there's a long tradition of Black folks who have lived in the hills or been able to raise their family to a middle class, because here in West Virginia, we had colleges available, Bluefield State, West Virginia State, Storer, before most of the nation made them available to other people. People came here for their education. But that's another part of history. Oh, what are we saying over here? This is really hard to read the chat. I'm having trouble seeing that, so.
There was another question. I was wondering, Judith, could you repeat the books that you had said, these are the basic starting places to read these books?
Oh, you mean the books that left me like depressed and on the couch?
They were part of your thing, just so that,
This Changes Everything, The End of Nature, The Sixth Extinction, which tells us the only things that are going to survive are rats and roaches because they're the most adaptable creatures. And E.O. Wilson, who's one of the best earth scientists you can imagine. His writing's just fantastic.
Okay, more questions or comments?
I have another one, if I can throw them out there. One, I think that Stephen's stories about the microaggression, I couldn't get over how powerful they were in the aggregate. And when you hear micro, you don't think much about it. And then when you realize the power of the whole weight of it, I mean, I think that that's a conversation that maybe Nest ought to have at other times, or we ought to organize, because it's pretty significant. And I hadn't heard it that way before. And I've been listening, I thought, but I hadn't heard it that way before.
Cool.
I appreciate that, Joe. I had just typed that in, that I was also really struck by Stephen talking about, the everyday injustices and microaggressions, and how do we stand up in that, right? Because it is that cumulative effect, which means that then, oh, what happens to the dream deferred? It explodes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I thought we could have a conversation about was Eileen's point about us not really knowing each other's culture, about having a bias when we thought about a Black culture versus a white culture. And that's a heck of a question to delve into. And as I started to play around with it, I said, well, I've sung Negro spirituals in church. I have a Black friend that I went drinking with. I mean, I was at a Black barbecue, and it was just like my family's barbecue, but not everybody has traveled in those circuits to gain some appreciation. And I think that's another takeoff point for other conversations. Thank you, Eileen, for that.
We live next door to each other, but we don't understand each other. We've lived in each other's lives a long time, and some people listen better to what is different than others. Some of us just assume that we are more alike in some specifics than we really are. And it takes a deeper desire to listen or to find out those differences. Every time I'm with Judith, I learn new things about Jewish culture. And I've been around Jews my whole life, but there are different little nuances that each of our friends bring us. That's why conversation's so magical. It always adds to our body of understanding. And I just love that. Thank you, Judith.
Judith, you're always teaching us stuff.
I'm learning from
I
Eileen.
I read Judith's blog about her trip on the Allagash with Joe Radner. And so, of course, I was introduced to the Yiddish word for portaging in a canoe is, of course, schlepping. So in a couple of minutes, we will be magically transported to other little rooms. So I just want to take a moment to have a moment of closure. I'm so grateful to our four panelists for all you have offered us this afternoon. I'm so grateful to everyone who has contributed thoughts or reflections or silent good energy to our room here. I only regret that we don't have more time to explore some of these themes. As I said, we would only scratch the surface. But I just want to remind us all to go forth and be active disenchanters and paradigm shifters and hope givers to one another, and keep creating spaces like this for each other, both within New England storytelling and all the circles in which we move. So thank you so much.